Chapter 1. An Unexpected Guest Saint. Mary Mead had always prided itself on being a village where nothing extraordinary ever happened. The seasons came and went with predictable regularity. Spring brought blossoms to Mrs. Earnshaw's prized cherry. Trees, summer filled Colonel Prothero's garden with roses that won prizes at the county fair. Autumn painted the lane with golden leaves, and winter brought carolers to the vicarage doorstep. It was this very predictability that made Miss Jane Marple so adept at noticing when something or someone was out of place. On this particular Tuesday in May, the village was preparing for the annual spring fete. The event, hosted on the expansive lawn of the vicarage, was the social highlight of the season. The Reverend Leonard Clement, a thin, scholarly man with a kind face weathered by years of offering guidance to his parishioners, was particularly flustered this year, due to the promised attendance of their new patron, Lord William Edgecombe of Gossington Hall. I simply don't know what Griselda was thinking, inviting him to stay at the vicarage, Reverend Clement confided to Miss Marple, as they arranged flowers in the church. We hardly have the space, and his reputation well. Miss Marple, a slight figure with snow-white hair, neatly arranged under a lace cap, her faded blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, nodded sympathetically. Young Lord Edgecombe has caused quite a stir since his return from abroad. Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned that he had quarrelled rather publicly with Sir Richard at the magistrates' dinner last month. Precisely my concern, the vicar sighed. Griselda insists it's our Christian duty to welcome him, especially as he's newly bereaved. His wife's death in Switzerland was quite sudden, I understand. Very sudden indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her nimble fingers arranging delphiniums with practised precision, much like my grandniece's neighbour in Eastbourne, apparently healthy one day, dead of heart failure the next, most unexpected for a woman of 32. The church door creaked open, admitting Griselda Clement, the vicar's much younger wife. At 25, she remained a surprise to the village, vivacious, modern, and utterly impractical. Today she wore a fashionable dress that caused the vicar to raise his eyebrows slightly. The most dreadful thing has happened, she announced without preamble. Lord Edgecombe has arrived a day early, and he's brought his secretary, Mr. Harris, and his late wife's sister, Miss Diana Westfield. She's quite beautiful, but terribly morose. They're all at the vicarage now, and Mrs. Hughes is in a state about lunch. Good heavens, the vicar murmured. I'd better return at once. Oh, and Colonel Prothero is there too, Griselda added. He arrived just as I was leaving, looking thunderous. Something about water rights and the stream that divides their properties. Miss Marple tied off her final arrangement with a neat bow. Perhaps I might call later this afternoon. I have those heritage rose cuttings the Colonel expressed interest in. Would you? Griselda clasped Miss Marple's hands gratefully. Lord Edgecombe mentioned he knew your late nephew, Raymond West, the author. Something about a house party in Capri last summer. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. Did he indeed? How very interesting! By the time Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage that afternoon, the atmosphere had grown decidedly tense. She was ushered into the drawing-room by the harried-looking parlour-maid to find an assembly that resembled nothing so much as a powder-keg awaiting a spark. Lord William Edgecombe dominated the room despite his slender frame. He was perhaps 40, with aristocratic features and cold grey eyes that assessed everything with cynical amusement. He was engaged in what appeared to be a deliberately provocative conversation with Colonel Prothero, a florid, bull-necked man, whose military bearing had not softened with retirement. "My solicitors have reviewed the property documents thoroughly, Colonel," Lord Edgecombe was saying. "The water rights have belonged to Gossington Hall since 1823. Your enthusiastic landscaping project must cease immediately." Colonel Prothero's face darkened dangerously. "My family has used that stream for generations, Edgecombe. Your father never objected. My father, Colonel, was notoriously lax about protecting family interests. I am not." Lord Edgecombe's smile did not reach his eyes. "As the current baronet, I intend to restore Gossington to its former glory and its former boundaries." A corner, a young woman with striking dark hair and hollow eyes, presumably Miss Diana Westfield, stared out the window, seemingly detached from the tension in the room. Beside her stood a nervous-looking man with spectacles whom Miss Marple took to be Mr. Harris, the secretary. He kept glancing between his employer and a notebook, as if documenting the exchange. Griselda made the introductions, her usual vivacity, strained. Miss Marple offered the rose cuttings to Colonel Prothero, who accepted them with gruff thanks before excusing himself with barely concealed fury. "You must forgive the Colonel," the vicar said diplomatically after Prothero's departure. "The stream project means a great deal to him. He's creating a memorial garden for his son, who was lost at Dunkirk." Lord Edgecombe raised an eyebrow. "Sentiment should not override legal rights, Vicar. William has always been rather particular about what belongs to him." Miss Westfield spoke suddenly, her voice soft but cutting. "Aren't you, brother dear? Even when it's something or someone he doesn't truly want." A charged silence followed this remark. Lord Edgecombe's expression hardened momentarily before he laughed, a sound devoid of humour. "My dear sister-in-law is still in mourning," he said smoothly. "Grief can make one indiscreet." Miss Marple observed the exchange with interest, her placid expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. But she noted the white-knuckled grip Miss Westfield maintained on her handkerchief, and the way Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the carpet. "Miss Marple," Lord Edgecombe turned to her with sudden charm, "Griselda mentions you knew my neighbour, Mrs. Bantry. I understand she sold Gossington Hall after her husband's death. Did you visit the property often?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Dolly Bantry and I were great friends. Such a lovely garden it had, though I always found the old well-house rather unsettling. Something about its proximity to the stream that divides the properties." For the briefest moment Lord Edgecombe's composure faltered. No one could have predicted that within 24 hours the vicarage would become the scene of a crime that would shatter the tranquillity of St. Mary, Mead forever, nor that Miss Marple's innocent mention of the well-house would prove remarkably prescient. Chapter 2. A Matter of Life and Death. The morning of the spring fete dawned with the kind of perfect English sunshine that seemed almost deliberately crafted for village festivities. Miss Marple was up early, tending to her garden before the heat of the day would make such work uncomfortable. She was carefully deadheading her prize-winning hydrangeas when she heard hurried footsteps on the gravel path. "Miss Marple! Oh, thank goodness you're up!" It was Griselda Clement, her face pale and her hair hastily pinned. She was still wearing her dressing gown, beneath a hastily donned coat. "Something dreadful has happened at the vicarage," Miss Marple straightened slowly, one hand at the small of her back. "My dear, whatever is the matter?" "It's Lord Edgecombe. He's been found dead in Leonard's study. Dr. Haydock says it looks like poison." Griselda's voice quavered. "Inspector Slack has been called from Much Benham, and he's put the whole house under restriction. The spring fete will have to be cancelled, of course, but that's hardly important now." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, removing her gardening gloves. "How very disturbing. When was he discovered?" "Just an hour ago. Mr. Harris went to wake him for breakfast and found the study door locked. When no one answered, Leonard had to force it open. Lord Edgecombe was slumped over the desk. Griselda shivered despite the warm morning. Miss Westfield became hysterical. She kept saying he got what he deserved over and over. It was most unsettling." "I imagine so," Miss Marple murmured. "And where was everyone else when this happened?" "That's just it," Griselda whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "Everyone had reason to be moving about the vicarage last night. Colonel Prothero came back after dinner for a late meeting with Lord Edgecombe. Something about resolving their dispute. Miss Westfield was apparently wandering the garden until midnight. She claimed she couldn't sleep. Mr. Harris was working late in the small parlour we converted to an office. Even Leonard was up, preparing his sermon in the kitchen since the study was occupied. And yourself, dear?" Griselda flushed slightly. "I took a sleeping powder and retired early. Lord Edgecombe had been quite attentive during dinner. It was making me uncomfortable." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "I'll come at once, of course." By the time they reached the vicarage, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Inspector Slack, a burly, efficient man with little patience for village sensibilities, had established his temporary headquarters in the dining room. The vicar looked utterly bewildered, sitting in an armchair while a constable took his statement. Mr. Harris was pacing the hallway, muttering to himself and occasionally scribbling in his ever-present notebook. Miss Westfield was nowhere to be seen. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack nodded curtly when he spotted her. "I might have known you'd appear." "Good morning, Inspector. I came to offer what assistance I could to the vicar and his wife." Just don't interfere with the investigation. We've got a locked room, a dead peer of the realm, and half the village with a motive." He consulted his notebook. Lord Edgecombe was last seen alive at approximately 11 last night, when the vicar brought him some brandy in the study. Death occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. according to Dr. Haydock. Poison in the brandy is the most likely cause, pending laboratory confirmation. "How very distressing," Miss Marple said mildly. "May I ask what type of poison is suspected?" Inspector Slack looked surprised at the question. "Dr. Haydock suggests cyanide, given the symptoms, quick and lethal. But that's hardly common knowledge, Miss Marple, so I'd appreciate your discretion." "Of course, Inspector. Cyanide has a very distinctive odour, I believe, rather like bitter almonds." "Precisely," Slack said, giving her a curious look. "Not everyone can detect it, though." "My late brother-in-law was a toxicologist," Miss Marple explained. "He was always discussing such things at dinner. Most educational, if somewhat unappetizing." At that moment, Colonel Prothero burst through the front door, his face thunderous. "What's this nonsense about Edgecombe being murdered? And why am I being treated as a suspect? The constable at my door wouldn't let me leave until now." Inspector Slack straightened. "You were one of the last people to see Lord Edgecombe alive, Colonel. Your dispute was common knowledge." "We resolved our differences last night," Prothero insisted. "He agreed to my using the stream in exchange for public acknowledgement of Gossington's formal ownership. We shook hands on it at 10:30, and I left immediately after." "Can anyone confirm your departure time?" Slack asked. "Miss Westfield was in the garden. She saw me leave." From the staircase came a hollow laugh. Diana Westfield stood there, looking even paler than the day before, her dark eyes enormous in her white face. "I saw you leave, Colonel, but I also saw you return an hour later, through the kitchen garden gate." Prothero flushed darkly. "That's a damnable lie." Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noticed Mr. Harris suddenly become very intent on his notebook. The secretary's hand trembled slightly as he wrote. "If I might inquire," she said softly, "was anything taken from the study? Documents, perhaps, or valuables?" Inspector Slack frowned. "How did you know? Lord Edgecombe's briefcase is missing. Apparently contained some papers of importance, according to Mr. Harris here." Mr. Harris looked up, startled at being addressed. "Yes, his lordship's new will. He'd just revised it yesterday afternoon." "And who?" asked Miss Marple, with the air of one making polite conversation. "Stands to benefit from his lordship's death." A heavy silence fell. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "That," he said grimly, "is precisely what I intend to find out." As the questioning continued, Miss Marple slipped away quietly to the vicarage garden. There, beneath an ancient yew tree, she found something that made her pale eyes sharpen with interest. Fresh soil recently turned, and beside it a gardening trowel that she was quite certain belonged not to the vicarage, but to Colonel Prothero's collection of fine gardening implements. Chapter 3. Village Whispers. By noon, news of Lord Edgecombe's death had spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency that only small villages can achieve. The cancelled spring fete provided the perfect opportunity for residents to gather in small clusters, exchanging theories with solemn faces that poorly concealed their excitement at such drama interrupting their quiet lives. Miss Marple, having carefully wrapped Colonel Prothero's trowel in her handkerchief and discreetly informed Inspector Slack of her discovery, had retreated to her cottage to attend to her correspondence. She was just finishing a letter to her nephew Raymond when a tentative knock sounded at her door. It was Mr. Harris, Lord Edgecombe's secretary, looking even more anxious than before, his spectacles slightly askew. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might speak with you? Privately?" His voice trembled slightly. "Inspector Slack has finished questioning me for now, and I remembered that you knew something about Gossington Hall." "Do come in, Mr. Harris," Miss Marple said kindly. "I was just about to have some tea." Once settled in her neat drawing-room with teacups before them, Mr. Harris seemed to struggle for words. "I don't know quite how to begin," he admitted. "Lord Edgecombe was not an easy man to work for, but I never wished him harm." "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured encouragingly. "The thing is, the papers that were stolen, the new will, I prepared it myself yesterday afternoon at his lordship's direction." Harris fidgeted with his teacup. Miss Westfield was to be completely disinherited. Everything was to go to a charity for wounded veterans, with a small annuity for me. Lord Edgecombe said it was because Diana, Miss Westfield, had been disloyal. But I think it was because she knew something. Something about his late wife's death, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently. Harris's head jerked up. How did you know? Lady Edgecombe's death in Switzerland was, well, the official verdict was heart failure. But Miss Westfield always insisted there was more to it. She claimed Lord Edgecombe had been systematically poisoning her sister with small doses of something over months. But she could never prove it. A very serious accusation, Miss Marple observed. Did Miss Westfield know about the new will? I believe so. I saw her watching from the garden while I was working in the study window seat. And later, I overheard her arguing with Lord Edgecombe. She said something like, "You won't get away with this too." The doorbell chimed, interrupting their conversation. Miss Marple excused herself, and returned moments later with Mrs. Dolly Bantry, the former mistress of Gossington Hall, an energetic woman with silver hair and shrewd eyes. "Jane, have you heard? It's absolutely dreadful. Poor William Edgecombe murdered, and in the vicarage of all places." She paused, noticing Harris. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." Introductions were made, and Mrs. Bantry settled herself comfortably. I knew Lord Edgecombe's father well, of course. Such a genial man. William was always more intense, even as a boy. "Mrs. Bantry," Harris ventured, "did you know anything about the old well house at Gossington? The one near the stream?" A shadow crossed Mrs. Bantry's face. "A nasty place. My husband had it sealed up years ago, after one of the village children nearly fell in. Why do you ask?" "Lord Edgecombe was very interested in it. He'd asked me to find the original property plans showing its location. He seemed to think something was hidden there." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she knitted, her expression thoughtful. "How curious. Colonel Prothero's new landscaping project is quite near that area, I believe." "It is indeed," Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "Arthur Prothero was quite put out when William started making a fuss about the water rights, especially given it's meant to be a memorial to poor Robert, Colonel Prothero's son," Miss Marple explained to Harris. "Lost at Dunkirk, though," she added delicately. "There was some uncertainty about his parentage, I understand." Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "Jane, I never knew you to be a gossip." "Not gossip, dear, merely observation. Young Robert had the Edgecombe chin, quite distinctive, and Lady Edgecombe, the previous one, William's mother, was known to be quite friendly with the Colonel before her death." Harris's eyes widened, behind his spectacles. "Are you suggesting that Robert Prothero was actually—" "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple said firmly, merely noting a family resemblance that was remarked upon locally. The telephone rang, and Miss Marple excused herself to answer it. When she returned, her face was grave. That was the vicar. "There's been another incident at the vicarage. Someone has broken into the study where Lord Edgecombe died. Inspector Slack is requesting we all return immediately." At the vicarage, they found a scene of fresh confusion. The study door stood open, revealing an overturned desk and scattered papers. Inspector Slack was directing constables with barely controlled frustration. "The crime scene has been compromised," he growled when he saw Miss Marple. "Someone forced the window while my men were questioning the household in the drawing room. Was anything taken? Miss Marple inquired. Hard to tell in this mess. But Dr. Haydock's preliminary report confirms cyanide poisoning. Slack's eyes narrowed as he looked at Harris. And we've discovered something else. A packet of cyanide was found in Mr. Harris's room, hidden in a book. Harris went deathly pale. That's impossible. I've never... It gets more interesting. Slack continued relentlessly. The book was a volume on Swiss law regarding inheritance. May I ask which book precisely? Miss Marple asked. International Inheritance Laws by Blackwell and Reed, opened to the chapter on Switzerland. Miss Marple's eyes lit with recognition. How very interesting. My nephew Raymond has that very volume in his library. He mentioned once that it had a distinctive binding, green leather with gold lettering. Inspector Slack looked surprised. That's correct. How did you know? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, I saw that same book yesterday afternoon, but it wasn't in Mr. Harris's possession. It was on the side table next to where Miss Westfield was sitting. As if conjured by her name, Diana Westfield appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury as she looked at Harris. You told them, didn't you? She accused. About William and my sister, about the will. Before Harris could respond, Miss Marple noticed something that made her breath catch. A familiar gardening trowel, now lying among the scattered papers on the floor, not where she had left it in Inspector Slack's evidence collection. Someone had moved it deliberately, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion as to why. Chapter 4. Threads of Connection. I assure you, Miss Westfield, Mr. Harris was merely answering questions put to him by the police, Miss Marple said calmly, stepping between the furious woman and the trembling secretary. Inspector Slack intervened, his voice gruff. Miss Westfield, you'll need to account for your movements last night and this morning, and I'd like to know how you recognize this book. He held up the green volume on international inheritance law, now safely enclosed in an evidence bag. It's William's. He always travelled with it. After Caroline, my sister, died, he became obsessed with inheritance laws. Diana's voice was flat. He used to gloat about how difficult it would be to challenge anything in Switzerland. And yet the book was found in Mr. Harris's room, Slack pointed out. That's absurd. It was in William's briefcase last night, the briefcase that's now missing. Diana turned her cold gaze to Harris. Unless someone planted it? Reverend Clement, who had been hovering anxiously in the background, cleared his throat. Inspector, might I suggest we move this discussion elsewhere? The body has been removed, but this room is still a crime scene, Slack finished tersely. Yes, which has now been compromised. Everyone out, please. As they filed into the drawing-room, Miss Marple noticed Griselda standing by the garden door, her face drawn with fatigue. The young woman beckoned to her discreetly. Miss Marple, Griselda whispered when they had stepped into the quiet of the Vicarage garden. Something odd happened last night that I forgot to mention. I woke around midnight. The sleeping powder never works well for me, and heard voices from the garden, a man and a woman arguing. Could you make out what they were saying? Miss Marple asked. Not clearly, but I heard the woman say something about justice for Caroline, and the man replied that some secrets should stay buried. Griselda shivered. I assumed it was Miss Westfield and her brother-in-law, but I never actually saw them. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you mention this to Inspector Slack?" "Not yet. There's been so much confusion. And—" Griselda hesitated. "I saw Colonel Prothero's gardening tools in our shed this morning. Leonard says he never borrowed them." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "Most peculiar." When they returned to the drawing-room, they found Colonel Prothero had arrived again, his manner defensive as Inspector Slack questioned him about his gardening implements. "My tools go missing all the time," he blustered. "The gardener borrows them, then forgets to return them. What's this about, anyway?" "One of your trowels was found in a rather significant location," Slack replied, deliberately vague. "When did you last see it?" "Yesterday morning, I should think. I was working on the memorial garden. What has this to do with Edgecombe's death?" "That remains to be established," Slack said. "Now, about your movements last night. They were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, a sturdy, white-haired man with a perpetually concerned expression. He beckoned to Inspector Slack, and the two conferred quietly in the corner. Miss Marple observed the doctor's increasingly troubled expression with interest. When Slack returned to the group, his face was grim. "Dr. Haydock has confirmed some unusual findings. The cyanide was indeed the cause of death, but there were also traces of another substance, digitalis." "Heart medicine?" Miss Marple asked innocently. Dr. Haydock looked surprised. "Yes, exactly. In small doses, it's used for heart conditions. In larger amounts, it's poison," Diana Westfield finished flatly. Just as Caroline was poisoned, her accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. "My sister didn't die of heart failure," Diana continued, her voice gathering strength. "She was poisoned over months. I tried to convince the Swiss authorities, but William had charmed them all. He's been poisoning her ever since they married. Small doses, building up gradually." "That's a very serious allegation," the vicar said uncomfortably. "It's the truth," Diana insisted. "And now he's dead the same way. Poetic justice." "Careful, Miss Westfield," Slack warned. "That sounds dangerously like a confession." "It wasn't me," she said coldly. "Though I can't say I'm sorry he's dead." Harris had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange. "Inspector, there's something else you should know. Lord Edgecombe kept a diary. He was writing in it last night before I left him in the study. It wasn't among his effects when you searched." "A diary?" Slack's interest was immediate. What sort of information did it contain? "Everything. He was meticulous about recording his activities, meetings, observations. If someone wanted to remove evidence of their interactions with him, it would be in that diary," Slack finished. "Where did he typically keep it?" "In his inside jacket pocket. Always." Miss Marple had been silent during this exchange, her knitting needles clicking softly. Now she spoke. "Inspector, I wonder if we might look more closely at the well house that's been mentioned. If Lord Edgecombe was so interested in it—" "The well house?" Mrs. Bantry, who had remained quietly observant until now, looked startled. "But it's been sealed for years." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple persisted, "it seems to connect several elements of this case. The property dispute, Lord Edgecombe's interest in the original plans, Colonel Prothero's memorial garden." Slack considered this. "It's worth investigating. Colonel, you'll need to show us the location." Prothero looked distinctly uncomfortable. It's on the boundary between Gossington and my property. But as I told you, the dispute was resolved before Edgecombe's death. Then you won't mind showing us, Slack said firmly. As they prepared to leave for the well house, Miss Marple noticed Diana Westfield slip something into her handbag, something small that glinted briefly in the light. Their eyes met, and for a moment Miss Marple glimpsed raw fear beneath the woman's cold exterior. "Miss Westfield," she said gently, "might I have a word before we leave? About your sister Caroline?" Diana hesitated, then nodded curtly. "You were very close to her?" Miss Marple asked when they had stepped aside. "She was all I had. Our parents died when we were young. I knew something was wrong when she started having heart episodes after marrying William. I'm a nurse. I recognized the symptoms of digitalis poisoning. And yet you came to stay at Gossington after her death." Diana's laugh was hollow. "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, Miss Marple. I came to find proof that William murdered Caroline, and I found it hidden in that well house." "Found what, exactly?" Miss Marple asked. But Diana only shook her head, her eyes darting nervously to where the others were gathering for the walk to Gossington. "Evidence. That's all I'll say now." As they set out, Miss Marple fell into step beside Mr. Harris. "Tell me," she asked conversationally, "did Lord Edgecombe ever mention a connection between his family and Colonel Prothero's son?" Harris's step faltered, not directly, but once, when he was in his cups, he mentioned something about Prothero's boy being more Edgecombe than he knew. "I never understood what he meant, I think," Miss Marple said softly. "We may find the answer at the well house, along with much else that has been hidden." And as they walked toward Gossington's grounds, Miss Marple could not help but notice how Colonel Prothero kept glancing anxiously toward the stream that divided the properties, the stream whose waters flowed directly past the sealed entrance of the old well house. Chapter 5. Secrets Unearthed. The path to Gossington Hall wound through a copse of ancient oaks before opening onto the expansive grounds of what had once been one of the finest estates in the county. Even now, with the main house shut up and the gardens untended since Mrs. Bantry's departure, it retained a certain faded elegance. Colonel Prothero led them with obvious reluctance, his military bearing at odds with his frequent hesitations. As they approached the boundary stream that had been the source of such contention, the Colonel's pace slowed further. "It's just beyond that stand of willows," he said gruffly, "though I don't see what possible relevance it could have to Edgecombe's death." Miss Marple, who had been observing Diana Westfield's increasingly tense demeanour, spoke up. "Inspector, before we proceed, I wonder if Miss Westfield might share what she found in the well house. It could save us considerable time." All eyes turned to Diana, who clutched her handbag more tightly. "I never said I found anything," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "You most certainly did," Miss Marple corrected her gently. "Just now, at the vicarage, you said you'd found evidence that Lord Edgecombe murdered your sister." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Miss Westfield, if you're withholding evidence—" "It's not what you think," Diana interrupted, her composure finally cracking. "It's a letter from Caroline to me. She knew William was poisoning her. She'd been collecting samples of her food and medicine, documenting her symptoms. She hid it all in the well house because it was the one place William never went. He was terrified of wells, had been ever since nearly drowning in one as a child. "This letter," Slack demanded. "Where is it?" After a moment's hesitation, Diana reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope, its edges softened with handling. "I found it 3 days ago, hidden in a loose stone by the well. I was going to take it to the authorities after the spring fete." Slack took the envelope carefully. "And you didn't think Lord Edgecombe's death might make this relevant sooner?" "I thought." Diana hesitated. "I thought perhaps justice had already been served." "By whom?" Slack pressed. "I don't know. Anyone who knew what he did to Caroline might have wanted him dead. Mr. Harris knew. I told him when I arrived at Gossington, showed him copies of Caroline's medical records." Harris blanched. I never believed it was deliberate. Lord Edgecombe spoke of his wife with such affection. He was a consummate actor," Diana said bitterly, "like father, like son." Mrs. Bantry, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly looked sharply at Diana. What an odd thing to say. William was born nearly 12 years after his father's previous child died in infancy. The old lord always called him his miracle child. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "How very interesting. Colonel Prothero, didn't you serve with the old Lord Edgecombe during the First War?" The colonel's face reddened. "What of it? Many of us local men served together." "And you were stationed near Gossington while on leave, recovering from your wounds, were you not? When the old Lady Edgecombe was often alone, her husband still abroad. I fail to see the relevance of ancient history," Prothero snapped. Inspector Slack, however, was watching the exchange with growing interest. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting—" "I'm merely noting certain parallels," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Family resemblances can be so telling." They had reached the well house, a small stone structure, half buried in the hillside, its entrance indeed sealed with heavy planks nailed across the doorway. But Miss Marple noticed immediately that several of the planks had been recently removed and replaced, the newer nails gleaming among the rusted ones. "Someone has been inside," she observed quietly. Colonel Prothero's hand went to his pocket, where a small bulge suggested a concealed object. "Nonsense! It's been sealed for decades." "Then you won't mind if we open it," Slack said, signalling to the constable who had accompanied them to bring forward the crowbar from his equipment bag. As the constable worked to remove the planks, Miss Marple drew close to Diana Westfield. "You found more than just the letter, didn't you? What else was hidden there?" Diana's eyes darted nervously to Colonel Prothero. "Nothing that concerns this investigation," she whispered. The last plank came, free with a protesting groan, revealing a dark opening and the top of stone steps descending into shadows. Inspector Slack produced a powerful torch and led the way, followed closely by the constable. Colonel Prothero held back, his expression a mixture of dread and resignation. The well house was larger inside than it appeared, a circular stone chamber, with a sealed well in the centre. The air was damp and had the musty scent of a place long undisturbed, except for the clear footprints in the dust and the freshly disturbed stonework around one particular section of wall. "Someone has been digging," Slack observed, directing his torch to where several stones had been removed and then replaced. The constable stepped forward to examine the area, but paused as his torch beam caught something metallic protruding slightly from behind the stones. "Sir, there's something here." As he reached toward it, Colonel Prothero suddenly surged forward. "Don't touch that! It's not safe!" The unexpected movement startled the constable, who stumbled backward, his torch clattering to the ground. In the momentary confusion, Prothero tried to push past Slack toward the wall, but the inspector caught his arm firmly. "What exactly isn't safe, Colonel?" he demanded. Before Prothero could answer, Miss Marple bent down and picked something up from the dusty floor, a small, worn, leather-bound book that must have fallen from the Colonel's pocket in the scuffle. "I believe," she said quietly, "this is Lord Edgecombe's missing diary." The Colonel seemed to deflate, his military bearing collapsing into the posture of a defeated man. "It's not what you think," he said, unconsciously echoing Diana's earlier words. "Then perhaps you'd better explain," Slack said, his voice hard. In the tense silence that followed, Miss Marple opened the diary, turning to the most recent entry. She read for a moment, then looked up, her gentle eyes suddenly sharp with understanding. "Oh dear," she said softly. "It wasn't about the stream at all, was it, Colonel? It was about what's hidden behind those stones. What you and the old Lord Edgecombe concealed here all those years ago. What William discovered and threatened to reveal." Colonel Prothero looked at her with a mixture of fear and resignation. "How could you possibly know?" "The diary mentions final proof of P's betrayal, hidden where water meets stone," Miss Marple replied. "And there's something else written here that I suspect changes everything we thought we knew about this case." She turned to Diana Westfield, whose face had gone deathly pale. "He wasn't just Caroline's husband, was he? William Edgecombe was also your half-brother, and I think you've known that for quite some time." Chapter 6. Family Ties Diana. Westfield's shock appeared genuine, but it lasted only a moment before hardening into something more controlled. "That's absurd. Caroline and I were sisters, both Westfields." "By your mother, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But the diary suggests otherwise regarding your father." Inspector Slack took the diary from Miss Marple and scanned the recent entries with growing concern. "Good Lord," he muttered, "if this is accurate." He looked up sharply. "Colonel Prothero, I think you'd better explain exactly what's hidden behind those stones." The Colonel seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes, his military bearing giving way to a weary slump. "It was during the war, the First War. Edgecombe and I served together. When I was injured, I recuperated at Gossington while he remained in France. His wife was lonely, and I was weak. You had an affair with Lady Edgecombe," Slack stated flatly. Brief but significant. When she realized she was with child, she confessed everything to her husband when he returned on leave. I expected him to call me out, but instead he claimed the child as his own, said his family line was too important to taint with scandal. "William," Miss Marple clarified, "Lord William Edgecombe was your son, not old Lord Edgecombe's." The Colonel nodded heavily. "The old lord made me swear never to reveal the truth. In exchange, he arranged a position for me locally and financial considerations." Blackmail, Slack said. A gentleman's agreement, Prothero corrected stiffly. But there were documents, letters between myself and Lady Edgecombe, a signed statement regarding William's true parentage. The old lord kept them as insurance against me ever. Speaking out, Mr. Harris, who had been listening with increasing discomfort, spoke up. Lord Edgecombe, William, mentioned finding family papers recently. He seemed disturbed by them, but wouldn't explain why. He found them here, Diana said suddenly, her voice hollow. 3 days ago, he'd been researching the original property, boundaries for the water rights dispute, and discovered references to items stored in the well house. He was like a man possessed after reading whatever he found. And you? Miss Marple asked gently. How did you learn of your relation to William? Diana's composure cracked. Caroline told me just before she died. She'd discovered it among William's papers, that we shared a father. She thought it explained his strange obsession with her, his controlling behaviour. She never knew. Her voice broke. She never knew he was poisoning her. The constable, who had been carefully removing the disturbed stones, suddenly paused. Sir, there's a metal box here. Inspector Slack directed him to remove it carefully. The small strongbox was old but intact, its lock broken recently. Inside, they found a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon, legal documents bearing official seals, and, at the very bottom, a small glass vial containing traces of a white powder. May I? Dr. Haydock asked, taking the vial. He uncorked it cautiously and tested a minute sample. Digitalis, almost certainly. Concentrated. And the letters? Slack inquired, examining the bundle. Correspondence between the old Lady Edgecombe and Colonel Prothero, Miss Marple confirmed, glancing at several pages. And yes, they confirm William's true parentage quite explicitly. But this doesn't explain the murder, Harris protested. Or why the Colonel had Lord Edgecombe's diary. I took it from his pocket, Prothero admitted. After I found him, he wasn't dead when I arrived for our late meeting. He was very much alive, triumphant even. He'd discovered the truth and was threatening to expose everything, not just his parentage, but his wife's murder. So you killed him, Slack said grimly. No. Prothero's denial was vehement. He was dying already when I arrived, convulsing. He managed to gasp that someone had poisoned him, someone who'd been in his rooms earlier. And you didn't report this? Slack demanded. I panicked, Prothero admitted. I saw the diary on the desk, open to a page detailing his discovery about his parentage and the well house. I took it, intending to destroy any evidence connecting us. Then I fled. Miss Marple had been quietly observing Diana Westfield, whose hand kept straying to her handbag. Inspector, she said softly, I believe Miss Westfield may have something else to share. Diana flinched. I don't know what you mean. The vial in your handbag, Miss Marple clarified. The one that's identical to the one found in this strongbox. You took it from the well house, didn't you? Along with Caroline's letter. For a moment, Diana looked as though she might deny it, but then resignation settled over her features. Slowly, she reached into her bag and withdrew a small glass vial nearly identical to the one found in the strongbox, though this one was half full. Caroline collected it as evidence, she said quietly. Samples of what William was putting in her food and medicine. I was going to have it analysed independently. And did you? Slack asked. Diana hesitated. No. One more question, Miss Marple interjected. The night Lord Edgecombe died, Griselda overheard an argument in the garden, a woman saying something about justice for Caroline, and a man replying that some secrets should stay buried. Was that you and William? Diana shook her head. No, I spoke with William in the study earlier that evening, but I retired immediately after. I was in my room all night. Then who? Slack began, but Miss Marple raised her hand slightly. I think, she said, we should ask Mr. Harris what he did with the digitalis he took from this strongbox 3 days ago, when he accompanied Lord Edgecombe to the well house. All eyes turned to Harris, whose face had gone deathly white. I don't know what you mean. Lord Edgecombe didn't come alone to the well house, Miss Marple explained. He brought his trusted secretary to document his findings, but Mr. Harris had his own reasons for being interested in what might be hidden here. Isn't that right, Mr. Harris? Or should I say, Mr. Harrison? Harris flinched at the name. You're Caroline Edgecombe's cousin, Miss Marple continued, on her mother's side. When she suspected her husband was poisoning her, she reached out to you for help. You changed your name and arranged to become Lord Edgecombe's secretary to gather evidence. How could you possibly know that? Harris whispered. The handwriting on the label of the vial. It matches notes in your notebook. And when you showed the diary entry to me, you displayed a certain familiarity with Caroline's maiden name. Most tellingly, there's a family resemblance around the eyes, the same as in the photograph of Caroline that Diana keeps in her locket. As Harris crumpled against the wall of the well house, Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. I believe, Inspector, we have found not only the method of Lord Edgecombe's murder, but also the means by which his wife was killed, and quite possibly our murderer. Chapter 7. Confessions and Denials. The walk back to the vicarage was conducted in tense silence. Inspector Slack had formally arrested Mr. Harris, or Harrison, as they now knew him, and the constable escorted him with firm professionalism. Diana Westfield followed a few paces behind, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Colonel Prothero walked with heavy steps, as though each one required tremendous effort. Miss Marple found herself alongside Mrs. Bantry, who spoke in a hushed voice. Jane, I never would have imagined. William Edgecombe, the Colonel's son, though I suppose it explains why the old lord was always so cold toward the boy. Family secrets, Miss Marple murmured, are so often at the root of present tragedies. As in the case of the Chattertons in the village, you remember. The grandfather who wouldn't acknowledge his daughter's child, only for that same child to inherit everything through a legal technicality. How does this connect to William's murder, though? Surely the secretary, Harrison, didn't kill him simply to avenge his cousin. I think, Miss Marple replied, we shall discover there's more to the story. At the vicarage, they found Griselda and the Reverend Clement waiting anxiously. Tea had been laid out, though nobody appeared particularly interested in refreshments. Inspector Slack set up in the drawing-room once again, arranging for the strongbox, and its contents to be properly catalogued as evidence. Mr. Harrison, he began formally, you are accused of the murder of Lord William Edgecombe by administering poison, specifically digitalis, in his brandy on the night of his death. Harrison, his spectacles slightly askew, and his scholarly demeanour replaced by dejection, shook his head. I didn't kill him. Yes, I took a sample of the digitalis from the well house. I needed proof of what had killed Caroline, but I never used it against William. You admit to being Caroline Edgecombe's cousin and changing your identity to investigate her death? Slack pressed. Yes. Caroline wrote to me when she first suspected William was poisoning her. She was gathering evidence, the samples, medical records, her own documentation of symptoms. When she died, I was certain William had murdered her, but I couldn't prove it. So I created a new identity and applied to be his secretary. A rather extreme measure, the vicar observed. Caroline was like a sister to me. We grew up together. When she married William, she seemed so happy. Harrison's voice broke. Then the heart episodes began. She knew what was happening, even as the doctors dismissed her concerns. And after gaining Lord Edgecombe's confidence, you discovered the connection to the well house, Slack continued. William found it, not me. He'd been researching the property boundaries for his dispute with Colonel Prothero. 3 days ago, he found references to documents stored in the well house by the previous Lord Edgecombe. He was excited. He thought it related to the water rights. When we broke in and found the strong box, he discovered the truth about his parentage, Miss Marple finished softly. He was devastated, then furious. He'd built his entire identity around being an Edgecombe. Finding out he was actually a Prothero. Harrison adjusted his spectacles nervously. But then he found the vial of digitalis, and something seemed to click for him. He became calculating, said he finally understood the pattern. What pattern? Slack demanded. He wouldn't elaborate. He just took the papers and the vial and locked them in his desk at the vicarage. That night, he started writing furiously in his diary. Diana, who had been silent until now, looked up. He knew, somehow, he realized that... She stopped abruptly. That what, Miss Westfield? Slack prompted. Diana hesitated, then continued reluctantly, that our father, Colonel Prothero, had also poisoned his wife. The previous Lady Prothero didn't die of influenza as reported. She was poisoned, just like Caroline. Colonel Prothero surged to his feet. That's a damnable lie. Margaret died during the influenza epidemic. Hundreds died that season, including your acknowledged son Robert, supposedly at Dunkirk, Diana countered. But Caroline found letters suggesting he actually died earlier, under mysterious circumstances, after threatening to expose family secrets. The vicar gasped. Surely you're not suggesting... A pattern, Miss Marple said quietly. 3 deaths, all connected to the Colonel, but no proof for any of them, until William found the digitalis. Inspector Slack studied Colonel Prothero with new interest. You were at the vicarage the night Lord Edgecombe died. You admitted meeting with him. I didn't kill the boy, Prothero protested. He was my son. A son who had just discovered you might be responsible for 3 suspicious deaths, Slack observed. A son with evidence that could ruin you. The Colonel seemed to collapse inward. I found him dying. That's the truth. I didn't administer the poison. But you knew it was poison immediately, Miss Marple pointed out. You recognized the symptoms because you'd seen them before. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even Inspector Slack seemed momentarily at a loss. It was Griselda who broke the tension, entering with a fresh pot of tea. I've just spoken with Dr. Haydock outside. He said to tell you he's confirmed the substance in both vials is indeed digitalis." "Both identical?" Miss Marple asked. "No, actually. He said the one from the strongbox is much older, degraded somewhat. The one Miss Westfield had is newer, pharmaceutical grade." All eyes turned to Diana, who paled. "Miss Westfield," Slack said slowly, "you claimed that vial contained samples your sister collected, but if it's newer, pharmaceutical grade digitalis—" "I can explain," Diana said weakly. "I believe you can," Miss Marple agreed. "You're a nurse, you said, with access to medical supplies." Diana's composure finally shattered. "Yes, I took it from the hospital where I work. I was going to use it on William. He deserved to die for what he did to Caroline, but someone beat me to it." "So you didn't poison Lord Edgecombe?" Slack clarified. "No, I planned to. I won't deny it. I came to Gossington with that intention, but when I arrived, I discovered something I hadn't known." She looked directly at Colonel Prothero. "That William was my half-brother, that Caroline had unknowingly married her own half-brother. It was monstrous." Harrison made a small, distressed sound. "You knew all this time?" "Only after I arrived at Gossington. I found Caroline's last letter in William's papers. She'd written to me about her suspicions, but the letter arrived after her death. William had intercepted it. In it, she explained everything. About William's parentage, about their blood relationship. That's why I went looking for the well house. I needed proof." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "The voices Griselda heard arguing in the garden, the night of the murder. That wasn't you and William?" Diana shook her head. "No, I confronted William earlier in the study. He didn't deny anything about Caroline, about our relationship. He seemed almost relieved that I knew. Said he'd make it right the next day." "By exposing Colonel Prothero," Harrison concluded. "So if neither Mr. Harrison nor Miss Westfield administered the poison," Inspector Slack said slowly, "and Colonel Prothero maintains his innocence." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "I believe," she said gently, "we should ask the vicar's wife what she put in Lord Edgecombe's brandy that night." Every head turned toward Griselda, who stood frozen in the doorway, the teapot still in her hands. "Griselda," the vicar whispered, disbelief etched on his face. The teapot slipped from Griselda's fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of china and hot liquid. "I heard them," she said, her voice barely audible. "In the garden. But it wasn't Diana. It was Mrs. Hughes, our housekeeper. She was William's mother." Chapter 8. The Housekeeper's Tale. "Mrs. Hughes." The vicar's voice was faint with disbelief. "Our housekeeper is Lord Edgecombe's mother." "But that's impossible. Lady Edgecombe died years ago." "Not Lady Edgecombe," Griselda said, her eyes fixed on Colonel Prothero. "You didn't recognize her, did you, Colonel? After all these years?" The Colonel stared back, confusion giving way to dawning horror. "Margaret! But she died. I attended her funeral." "A closed casket, I believe," Miss Marple commented softly. "So convenient when one wishes to disappear." Inspector Slack, struggling to keep pace with these revelations, held up his hand. "Let me understand this clearly. You're suggesting Mrs. Hughes, the vicarage housekeeper, is actually the supposedly deceased Lady Prothero, the Colonel's wife?" "Former wife," Miss Marple corrected. And yes, that appears to be the case. How long has Mrs. Hughes been with you, Vicar? Nearly 15 years, Reverend Clement replied, still looking stunned. She came with excellent references from a household in Northumberland. 15 years, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Just after the influenza epidemic that supposedly claimed Lady Prothero's life. But why would she fake her death? Fear, Diana said with sudden insight. She was afraid of him. She gestured toward Colonel Prothero. She discovered he was poisoning her, just as William poisoned Caroline. So she fled, changed her identity. Preposterous, Prothero blustered, but his protest lacked conviction. Not so preposterous, Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Hughes has always been unusually well-spoken for a housekeeper. Wouldn't you agree, Vicar? And she wears gloves indoors, perhaps to hide the distinctive Prothero family ring that Lady Margaret was known to wear, the one that would have made her instantly recognizable. "Where is Mrs. Hughes now?" Slack demanded. "In her quarters, I believe," Griselda answered. "She was quite distressed after the murder, and has kept to herself since." Slack dispatched the constable to find the housekeeper, then turned back to Griselda. "You still haven't explained your own role in this, Mrs. Clement. Miss Marple suggested you put something in Lord Edgecombe's brandy." Griselda sank into a chair, suddenly looking very young and frightened. "A sleeping powder. Nothing more, I swear it. Lord Edgecombe had been inappropriate during dinner, making suggestions, touching my hand when Leonard wasn't looking. When Leonard asked me to take him some brandy, while he was working in the study, I added a sleeping powder. I thought it would make him drowsy, keep him in his room for the rest of the evening." "A sleeping powder wouldn't kill him," Dr. Haydock confirmed, "though it might have enhanced the effects of the digitalis." "And how did you come to hear Mrs. Hughes in the garden?" Slack pressed. "I couldn't sleep. I was worried about what I'd done. I heard voices and went to the window. Mrs. Hughes was arguing with someone, a man. I couldn't see who. She said, 'He's my son. I won't let you destroy him.' And the man replied that some secrets should stay buried. Then I heard the study door open and close." The constable returned, looking concerned. "Sir, Mrs. Hughes isn't in her quarters. Her belongings are gone, too." "She's run," Slack said grimly. "Again." "Not without saying goodbye," came a quiet voice from the doorway. Mrs. Hughes stood there, a thin, dignified woman with silver-streaked dark hair and haunted eyes that now focused on Colonel Prothero, with a mixture of fear and defiance. She wore a travelling coat and carried a small valise. "Margaret!" Prothero whispered, rising slowly to his feet. "It's not possible." "I should have left yesterday," she said, ignoring him and addressing Inspector Slack. "But I couldn't go without knowing if—" her voice faltered. "Without knowing if my son was at peace." "You admit to being Lady Margaret Prothero?" Slack asked. "I was once. I've been Sarah Hughes for 15 years. No one looked twice at a quiet widow seeking domestic work." "And Lord William Edgecombe was your son?" "Yes," she said simply. "Though he never knew it. Richard Prothero would have killed us both if he'd found us." The colonel took a step toward her. "Margaret, I never—" "You poisoned me," she cut him off, gradually, just as William later poisoned Caroline. "I recognized the symptoms because my father was a doctor. I kept my own samples, just as Caroline did. When I realized what was happening, I knew I had to disappear. "Why not go to the authorities?" Slack asked. "With what proof? Against a respected colonel? I had a young son to protect. So I arranged my death during the influenza epidemic. So many bodies, so little examination. I left William with my sister and her husband in London, knowing Richard would never look for him there. My sister raised him as her own." "But how did he become Lord Edgecombe?" the vicar asked, bewildered. "My sister married Edward Westfield, who died young. Years later, she married the old Lord Edgecombe, who adopted William. A bitter irony, William grew up as the heir to Gossington Hall, while his true father lived just across the stream." "And you came to work at the vicarage," Miss Marple prompted, "to be near William, to watch over him from a distance. When he inherited Gossington, and moved back, I thought, perhaps." Her composure cracked slightly. "But he'd become so like his father. The way he treated his wife, I saw the signs. I tried to warn Caroline, but she wouldn't listen." "Did William discover who you were?" Slack asked. Mrs. Hughes nodded. 3 days ago, after finding the papers in the well house, he recognized my handwriting on one of the letters. He confronted me that night in the garden. He was changed. He said he finally understood everything. About his father, about his wife. He promised to make things right the next day. "By exposing Colonel Prothero," Harrison suggested. "Yes. He said it was time for justice. For me, for Caroline." Her eyes hardened as she looked at the colonel. "He was going to announce everything at the spring fete, reveal you for what you are." "And so you poisoned him," Slack concluded. "Your own son." "No!" Mrs. Hughes looked genuinely shocked. "I would never harm William. I came to the vicarage that night to try once more to reach the good in him, to persuade him there were better ways to seek justice. But when I arrived, he was already dying." Diana stepped forward. "Then who?" Mrs. Hughes looked directly at Colonel Prothero. "Ask him about the brandy decanter in the study, the one from which William was served his last drink. Ask him when he arrived at the vicarage that night. Not for a late meeting, but hours earlier, while the household was at dinner." All eyes turned to Colonel Prothero, whose military bearing had completely disintegrated. "Is this true, Colonel?" Slack demanded. For a moment, it seemed Prothero might continue to deny everything. Then his shoulders slumped. "I knew William was planning something at the spring fete. My gardener overheard him talking to Harrison, about revealing the truth and justice for 3 deaths. I had to stop him." The colonel's voice was hollow. "I came to the vicarage while everyone was at dinner. The study was empty. I added the digitalis to the brandy decanter, not the bottle, but the decanter already set out on the desk. I knew it was the one William would use later." Miss Marple had been silent during these revelations, her knitting needles still. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but penetrating. "But you made one crucial mistake, didn't you, Colonel? You didn't know that someone else had already added something to that same decanter." The colonel's face showed confusion. "What do you mean?" "Griselda's sleeping powder," Miss Marple explained. "Added just before you arrived. The combination proved far more lethal than either substance alone might have been." "So it was an accident?" Diana asked incredulously. "A coincidence? Not entirely," Miss Marple replied. The Colonel certainly intended harm, but I suspect he measured the digitalis carefully, enough to make William ill, perhaps to discredit him, but not to kill him instantly. The sleeping powder accelerated and enhanced the effect. 2 poisons, Dr. Haydock murmured, working in concert. Yes, that would explain the unusual progression of symptoms. As Inspector Slack formally arrested Colonel Prothero for the attempted murder of Lord William Edgecombe and the suspicious deaths of Lady Margaret Prothero and Caroline Edgecombe, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Hughes, the woman who had lived as a ghost for 15 years to escape the very fate that had eventually claimed her son. "The pattern," Miss Marple said softly to herself. William recognized the pattern indeed. Chapter 9. Threads Unraveled. The vicarage drawing-room had fallen silent following Colonel Prothero's confession. Inspector Slack had taken him away, along with the various pieces of evidence. Mrs. Hughes, or Lady Margaret, as they now knew her, sat quietly by the window, her valise still at her feet, as though uncertain whether to stay or continue her flight. Diana Westfield approached her cautiously. "You're my aunt? Truly?" Mrs. Hughes nodded. "Your mother, Elizabeth, was my sister. She never knew what happened to me. I thought it safer that way. She believed, like everyone else, that I had died. And Caroline was actually William's cousin, not his half-sister," Diana said, the relief evident in her voice. "Yes, William was born before I married Richard Prothero. Elizabeth raised him as her own after my disappearance." Mrs. Hughes twisted her gloved hands in her lap. "When Elizabeth later married Lord Edgecombe, and he adopted William, I thought perhaps my son would be safe at last, protected by wealth and position." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, spoke gently. "But wealth and position don't always protect us from our own natures, do they? William had his father's temperament, Colonel Prothero's need for control, his ruthlessness. I saw it emerging as he grew older," Mrs. Hughes admitted. "I tried to guide him from a distance, but a housekeeper has limited influence. When he began courting Caroline, I was horrified, not because they were related by blood, but because I recognized in him the same possessiveness Richard had shown toward me." Mr. Harrison, who had been temporarily released from custody pending further investigation, adjusted his spectacles nervously. "If you suspected William was poisoning Caroline, why didn't you intervene more directly?" "I tried. I warned Caroline, but she thought I was just a meddling servant. By the time she began to suspect something was wrong, it was too late. William was too careful, too clever. Just as the Colonel had been with you," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Hughes nodded sadly. "History repeated itself in the most terrible way. Reverend Clement, who had been struggling to process these revelations about his trusted housekeeper, cleared his throat. 'Mrs. Hughes, Lady Margaret, will you be leaving us?' She looked up, startled. 'I assumed you would want me to go, after all the deception.' 'Nonsense,' Griselda said firmly, though her eyes were red from crying. 'This has been your home for 15 years. You've committed no crime. Except, perhaps, identity fraud,' Inspector Slack commented, returning to the room. 'Though under the circumstances I doubt any court would pursue the matter.' 'What will happen to Colonel Prothero?' the vicar asked. 'That depends on what evidence we can gather regarding the previous deaths,' Slack replied. 'He's admitted to attempting to poison Lord Edgecombe, but maintains the death was unintentional, a result of the combination with Mrs. Clement's sleeping powder. And technically, he's right, Dr. Haydock concurred. The interaction of the two substances created an effect neither alone would likely have produced. A most unusual case. He'll still stand trial for attempted murder at the very least, Slack continued. As for Lady Margaret's supposed death and Caroline Edgecombe's suspicious passing, those investigations will take longer. Diana had moved to the window, staring out at the vicarage garden, now bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. What happens to Gossington Hall now, with William gone and no direct heir? I believe, Miss Marple said quietly, that William's will, the one before his recent revision, left everything to you, Diana, as Caroline's sister. Unless Mr. Harrison has information to the contrary. Harrison shook his head. No, that's correct. Diana is the heir, assuming the new will isn't found, and since I never prepared a final copy. Diana turned, her expression conflicted. I don't want it. Not Gossington. Not anything of William's. Perhaps, Mrs. Hughes suggested hesitantly, you might consider the memorial garden Colonel Prothero was creating. It was meant for Robert, William's half-brother in a way. It would be a fitting tribute to all those caught in this web of deception. A place of healing rather than secrets, the vicar murmured approvingly. As the others continued discussing arrangements, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Harrison slip quietly from the room. Curious, she followed him to the vicarage study, where she found him standing before the desk, looking lost. Mr. Harrison, she said softly, or should I call you by your real name? He started, then smiled sadly. James Harrison is my real name. I only changed my surname slightly, from Harriman to secure the position with Lord Edgecombe. Not a very creative disguise, I'm afraid. But effective enough. You were quite devoted to your cousin Caroline. We grew up together, almost like siblings. When she wrote to me about her suspicions, I didn't take them seriously enough. By the time I did, he gestured helplessly, I failed her. Yet you risked everything to discover the truth, Miss Marple observed. That shows considerable loyalty, a loyalty that nearly got me charged with murder. Harrison removed his spectacles, polishing them absently. I keep wondering if I could have prevented all this somehow. If I'd confronted William directly instead of playing detective, I suspect the outcome would have been much the same, Miss Marple said gently. William had already set a course toward self-destruction when he discovered the truth about his parentage. Sometimes the past refuses to remain buried, no matter how carefully we tend the soil above it. Harrison replaced his spectacles, regarding Miss Marple with newfound respect. How did you know about my connection to Caroline? I was so careful. Miss Marple smiled. It reminded me of the Ellison case in the village. A nephew who pretended to be a gardener to investigate his aunt's suspicious fall. The same attention to detail, but occasional lapses in the role. You called Diana Miss Westfield before anyone had mentioned her surname, and you knew exactly which drawer of Lord Edgecombe's desk contained his personal correspondence. Small things, Harrison mused. Murder investigations often turn on small things, Mr. Harrison. A trowel in the wrong place, a book with a distinctive binding, a secretary who knows too much about his employer's wife, They were interrupted by Inspector Slack, who appeared in the doorway. "Miss Marple, the Chief Constable would like your statement at the station tomorrow morning. And Mr. Harrison, you're free to go for now, but don't leave the county." As they walked back to the drawing-room, Harrison paused. "Miss Marple, there's one thing I still don't understand. How did you know to connect Mrs. Hughes to Lady Margaret Prothero? What gave her away?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Her knitting, Mr. Harrison. She favours a very distinctive cable stitch that I have only ever seen in one knitting circle, the Ladies' Auxiliary of the regiment where Colonel Prothero once served, and her hands gloved always, even in summer. Quite unnecessary for a housekeeper, but essential for a woman hiding a distinctive family ring." "Remarkable," Harrison murmured. "Not really," Miss Marple replied modestly. "Just observation. In my experience, people reveal themselves in the smallest of habits. Like Colonel Prothero's tendency to tap his left pocket whenever he was anxious, where I later discovered he kept that distinctive trowel. The items we keep close often tell the most revealing stories." As they rejoined the others, Miss Marple couldn't help but observe how Diana had moved to sit beside Mrs. Hughes, the two women, aunt and niece, beginning the tentative process of reconstructing a family shattered by secrets and lies. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, the most poisonous thing was not what was added to a brandy decanter, but what was hidden in the dark corners of a family's past, quietly toxic until disturbed by the light of truth. Chapter 10. Resolutions. 3 days after Colonel Prothero's confession, St. Mary Mead was beginning to settle back into its usual rhythms. The postponed spring fete had been quietly cancelled, replaced by a more subdued garden party at the Vicarage, scheduled for the following month. The villagers, having thoroughly dissected every aspect of the scandal in hushed conversations over garden fences and tea-room tables, were gradually finding new topics of interest. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the morning sunshine while deadheading her roses. The sound of the garden gate latch clicking made her look up to see Griselda Clement approaching down the path. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Griselda called, looking considerably more rested than she had in days. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, my dear. Would you care for some tea? I was just about to take a break." Once settled with teacups on the small table beneath Miss Marple's favourite apple tree, Griselda sighed. "I wanted to thank you properly. The inspector told Leonard you were instrumental in solving the case." "Inspector Slack is being generous," Miss Marple demurred. "I merely observed a few inconsistencies. More than a few, I think." Griselda stirred her tea absently. "I still can't believe our Mrs. Hughes was actually Lady Margaret Prothero all these years. She's decided to stay on, you know. Says the vicarage is more her home now than anywhere else could be." A wise decision. Starting over at her age would be difficult, especially with the notoriety the case has generated. "The newspapers have been dreadful," Griselda admitted, "though thankfully they've focused more on the Colonel than on my part in it all." Miss Marple regarded the young woman sympathetically. "You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. You had no way of knowing about the Colonel's actions." "I know, but I keep thinking, if I hadn't added that sleeping powder, then Lord Edgecombe might still have died from the digitalis, just more slowly and painfully," Miss Marple pointed out gently. Or he might have survived to expose the Colonel, which would likely have led to more tragedy. We can never know how events might have unfolded differently. Griselda nodded, though she looked unconvinced. The solicitors say there will be an inquest, but Dr. Haydock believes I won't face charges given the circumstances. That seems most likely. The Colonel's confession has clarified matters considerably. He's refusing to discuss the deaths of his wife and Caroline Edgecombe, though, Griselda said. Simply repeats that Margaret died of influenza, and he knows nothing about Caroline's death in Switzerland. Not unexpected, Miss Marple commented. Some truths are too damning to admit, even when other crimes have been confessed. They were interrupted by the arrival of Diana Westfield and Mrs. Hughes, who had spotted them from the lane. Diana looked transformed. The cold, brittle edge that had defined her now softened into something more contemplative. "We're on our way to Gossington," Diana explained after greetings were exchanged. "I've decided to reopen the house, at least temporarily." "A significant undertaking," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, but a necessary one. I can't simply abandon the place, whatever my feelings about William." And Aunt Margaret, Diana smiled at Mrs. Hughes, the familial term still new on her lips, "has agreed to help me sort through things." Mrs. Hughes, still wearing her habitual gloves despite her identity, being known, nodded. "There are memories at Gossington worth preserving, despite everything. We're converting part of the grounds into a public garden," Diana continued. "The section by the stream where Colonel Prothero was planning his memorial. It seems fitting, somehow. A place of healing," Miss Marple echoed the vicar's earlier words. "Most appropriate." "Will you be staying in St. Mary Mead permanently?" Griselda asked Diana. "I don't know yet. The investigation into Caroline's death is being reopened. The Swiss authorities are exhuming her body at my request. Once that's resolved," she shrugged. "Perhaps. This village seems to have a way of revealing truths, however deeply buried." "Sometimes too deeply," Mrs. Hughes said softly. After Diana and Mrs. Hughes had continued on to Gossington, Griselda lingered clearly, still troubled. "There's something else," she admitted. "Mr. Harrison came to the vicarage this morning. He's found William's briefcase, the one that went missing the night of the murder." Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. "Indeed? Where was it?" "Hidden in the old gardening shed. The final version of the new will was inside, along with—" Griselda hesitated, along with detailed notes about Caroline's symptoms and the digitalis dosages William had been administering. He'd been documenting everything, Miss Marple, like a scientific experiment. "A family trait, it seems," Miss Marple murmured. "The Colonel kept similar records about his wife's influenza, according to Lady Margaret. There was also a letter addressed to Diana. Harrison brought it to her just now." Griselda shivered despite the warm morning. William knew what the Colonel had done to Lady Margaret. He discovered it when he found the papers in the well house. In his letter, he says he realized he'd become just like his father, poisoning his wife the same way Prothero had poisoned his. It drove him to a kind of madness. "Or perhaps clarity," Miss Marple suggested. "Sometimes recognizing the darkness in ourselves can be a step toward redemption." "He was planning to confess everything at the spring fete," Griselda continued. "Not just expose the Colonel, but admit his own crimes regarding Caroline. The letter says he wanted to break the pattern once and for all. but someone else broke it for him, Miss Marple observed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage for tea with the vicar, finding him in his study sorting through parish correspondence. The room had been thoroughly cleaned, all traces of the tragedy removed, but Miss Marple noticed he had rearranged the furniture, the desk now positioned away from where Lord Edgecombe had died. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly. "I was just thinking about next Sunday's sermon. Something about truth and reconciliation seems appropriate, don't you think?" "Very fitting, Vicar." As they settled in the drawing-room with Mrs. Hughes serving tea, a strange new normalcy establishing itself, the vicar shook his head wonderingly. "I still can't quite believe it all. 3 generations of secrets and deceptions coming to a head in our little vicarage. Human nature doesn't change much, regardless of setting," Miss Marple remarked. "The same passions and frailties that drive people in great cities operate just as powerfully in small villages." "I suppose you're right," he agreed, "though I confess I'm ready for a period of uneventful parish life." Miss Marple smiled. "I suspect St. Mary Mead will oblige you, for a time at least." As she walked home later, Miss Marple paused by the lane that led to Gossington Hall. In the distance she could see Diana and Mrs. Hughes walking slowly through the gardens, 2 figures linked by blood and tragedy, beginning the delicate process of rebuilding what had been shattered by secrets. Some wounds, Miss Marple reflected, never truly healed. They merely scarred over, becoming part of the landscape of one's life. The Colonel's poisoning of his wife, William's poisoning of Caroline, the Colonel's final attempt to silence his son, a pattern indeed woven through generations. But patterns could be broken, as Diana and Mrs. Hughes were demonstrating now. Chiche. Marple turned toward home, her sharp eyes noting the first evening primroses opening their pale yellow blooms in the hedgerow. Life continued, as it always did in St. Mary Mead, the rhythms of the village flowing around the eddies of human drama, like the stream that divided Gossington from the Colonel's land, sometimes disturbed, but never truly diverted from its course. Chapter 11. The Last Secret. A fortnight after Colonel Prothero's arrest, Miss Marple was engaged in her usual Thursday morning ritual of arranging flowers for the church altar. The peaceful activity had always provided her with a welcome opportunity for reflection, and today her thoughts kept returning to the lingering loose ends of the Edgecombe case. The church door creaked open, admitting Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who bustled down the aisle with her characteristic energy. "Jane, I thought I'd find you here. Have you heard the news?" "Which news would that be, Dolly?" Miss Marple asked mildly, adjusting a particularly recalcitrant lily. "About Diana Westfield. She's decided to donate Gossington Hall to be converted into a convalescent home for veterans. She's keeping only the cottage by the stream for herself and Mrs. Hughes, or Lady Margaret, though I can't quite get used to calling her that after all these years of Mrs. Hughes, pass the potatoes." "Oh, generous gesture," Miss Marple commented, though not entirely surprising. Diana never wanted Gossington for herself. "Yes, but there's more." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, despite the empty church. "The Swiss authorities have completed their examination of Caroline Edgecombe's remains. They found significant traces of digitalis, just as Diana suspected. William really was poisoning her. Miss Marple nodded sadly. Poor Caroline. If only she'd been able to gather enough evidence before it was too late. There's talk of a posthumous case against William, though it seems rather pointless now. Mrs. Bantry settled on a nearby pew, watching Miss Marple work. What I can't understand is why William would document his own crime so meticulously. Those notes in his briefcase were practically a confession. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that William was rather like his father in more ways than one. The Colonel was a military man, accustomed to keeping detailed records. William inherited that methodical nature, along with darker tendencies. A poisoner's diary. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. It's all too ghastly, indeed, though it does provide closure for Diana and Lady Margaret. Miss Marple stepped back to assess her arrangement. Is there any news of the Colonel? He's refusing visitors, according to Griselda. Not that many are clamouring to see him. The preliminary hearing is next week, but it's all rather a formality with his confession. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Harrison, looking more settled than he had during the investigation. The scholarly demeanour that had once seemed like a careful disguise now appeared to be his natural state. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you before I leave. Your insights were invaluable in uncovering the truth." "You're returning to London?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes, now that Diana has dealt with the legal matters regarding Gossington. My role as executor is complete." He hesitated, though I find myself reluctant to leave St. Mary Mead entirely. "The village does have a way of drawing one in," Mrs. Bantry observed with a knowing smile. "I've noticed you've been spending considerable time helping Diana with the Gossington conversion plans." Harrison adjusted his spectacles, a faint blush colouring his cheeks. "Diana has endured so much. If I can be of assistance during this transition—" "Most commendable," Miss Marple murmured, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Bantry. "I understand. You'll be managing the Memorial Garden project?" "Yes, it seems fitting. A tribute to those whose lives were damaged by secrets and deception. Diana suggested we incorporate plantings that represent healing and truth. White roses, rosemary, thyme." After Harrison had departed, Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "Well, that's developing just as I predicted. Poor man is clearly smitten." "And Diana seems to value his steadiness," Miss Marple agreed. "After such turbulence, stability becomes particularly appealing." The church door opened again, this time admitting Inspector Slack, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Miss Marple," he nodded curtly. "Mrs. Bantry." "Inspector, don't tell me there's been another murder," Mrs. Bantry asked with undisguised eagerness. "Nothing so dramatic. Just tying up some administrative loose ends." He glanced at Miss Marple. "The Chief Constable asked me to convey his thanks for your assistance. The case file has been closed officially." "I'm glad I could be of help," Miss Marple replied, "though I sense something still troubles you, Inspector." Slack shifted uncomfortably. "It's the Colonel. He's made a full written confession regarding Lord Edgecombe's death, but maintains his innocence regarding his wife and Caroline. Yet the pattern is unmistakable." "Patterns can be deceptive," Miss Marple observed, adjusting a final bloom in her arrangement. "Or perhaps selective confession is the Colonel's way of preserving some shred of dignity." "Perhaps," Slack seemed unconvinced. "There's one other matter. We searched the gardening shed where William's briefcase was found. Behind a loose board, we discovered another vial of digitalis. Older than the others, partially used. Most interesting," Miss Marple commented. "Did it match the sample from the strongbox? Identical, according to Dr. Haydock. And there were fingerprints on it, not the Colonel's or William's." Miss Marple's hands stilled among the flowers. "Lady Margaret's?" Slack nodded grimly. "It appears she may have taken the original vial from the strongbox years ago, when she faked her death. Dr. Haydock believes she may have been building immunity by taking small doses, a technique sometimes employed to protect against poisoning, meaning she knew the Colonel was poisoning her long before she disappeared," Miss Marple concluded. "How very resourceful of her." "Indeed, though it raises questions about her involvement in recent events." After Inspector Slack had departed, Mrs. Bantry looked thoughtfully at Miss Marple. "You don't seem surprised by this revelation about Lady Margaret." "Not entirely," Miss Marple admitted. "During our conversations, I noticed certain inconsistencies in her account. Her medical knowledge seemed rather extensive for someone who merely had a doctor for a father. You think she knew more than she admitted? About William's poisoning of Caroline, I think," Miss Marple said carefully. "That a mother who had survived one poisoning attempt might be particularly attuned to the signs of another, and might feel a terrible conflict if the poisoner was her own son." "Jane, you can't possibly be suggesting that Lady Margaret—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "merely observing that in families damaged by secrecy and betrayal, the truth is rarely simple." As they left the church together, they passed the vicarage garden where Griselda was planting autumn bulbs, her movements suggesting a new sense of purpose. Beyond, on the path to Gossington, they could see two figures walking side by side, Diana and Harrison, deep in conversation. "Life continues," Mrs. Bantry observed, "despite everything." "As it must," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect Lady Margaret carries one final secret that may never come to light." "What makes you say that?" Miss Marple paused, considering her words carefully. "The night Lord Edgecombe died, Griselda overheard voices in the garden, woman saying something about justice for Caroline. We assumed it might have been Diana, but she denied it. And you think it was Lady Margaret? But why would she—" Mrs. Bantry stopped, realization dawning. "Oh, Jane, you don't mean—" "I mean nothing definite," Miss Marple said firmly. "Merely that a mother who had once been a victim might go to extraordinary lengths to prevent history from repeating itself, especially if she believed no one else would ever bring her son to justice." "A terrible choice," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Indeed, though perhaps in Lady Margaret's mind a necessary one. To break the pattern once and for all." They parted ways at Miss Marple's garden gate, the unspoken possibility hanging between them like the last leaf of autumn waiting to fall. Some secrets, Miss Marple reflected as she watched Mrs. Bantry's retreating figure, were perhaps better left undisturbed, buried as deeply as the old well house that had started it all. Justice and truth, after all, were not always identical twins, however closely related they might be. Sometimes, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, justice wore a different face, one that official investigations might never fully recognize, but that Miss Jane Marple with her lifetime of observing human nature, could acknowledge with her characteristic compassion and her unflinching acceptance of life's deeper complexities.